All right, today we're going to talk about one aspect that you hear a lot in this time of year. So you got your nativity. Well, then there were also these wise men, these magi. We're going to find out a little bit about who these guys were. So normally you'll hear more of a preaching, but today is going to be more of a teaching. So we're going to find out a little bit more about these wise guys. So we're going to start with our Old Testament. It's just going to be a couple verses from the Old Testament. And it might seem a little disconnected at first, but hopefully you'll get why I chose these. Daniel 4:9 says, O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is difficult for you, say to me the vision of my dream, which I have seen, along with its interpretation. Now, Belteshazzar was the name given to Daniel. And this was the king that was speaking to him. So I just wanted you to look at the part that says chief of the magicians, right? And now we're going to go to Daniel 5:11. There was a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, set him as chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. So I want you to look at the fact that they're referring to Daniel. They don't have an understanding of Daniel or his God, so they say the holy gods. So even the unsaved pagan world knew that there was something about Daniel. And King Nebuchadnezzar, so the second verse was somebody was speaking to the new king, the son of King Nebuchadnezzar after Nebuchadnezzar died. But Daniel was still around in that time, and he was there for a succession of kings from different places that took over that area. But he was set as the chief of the magicians. From the magicians, that's where we get the word magi. The magi is the root. That was actually a tribe of people. So we're going to go into that. My sermon I called The Wise Men and the Fool. Now, this will probably be about a two-part thing. So this week I'll touch on, Matthew chapter 2. Next week will be Luke chapter 2. For the time of year that we're in. Who were these wise men? And why were they in the narrative anyway? Why does the Bible even talk about these wise men? Well, there's a reason for it, and we'll get to that. The wise men were called magi. They were a tribe of people. Some believe that they go all the way back to Abraham, or maybe even before. Nobody knows exactly where, but they think they were around in the time of Abraham when he was Abram. And he lived in a place called Ur of the Chaldees. Did you notice up in Daniel, called him it says chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. So these people, these men, were a group of people, a tribe of people. So there were thousands of these people that were considered to be the wise men. And they were wise in pagan idolatry and a lot of things. And they were diviners, meaning they would, we call it astrology today, or they were also, in science, they were astronomers. So these people did have a lot of knowledge of mathematics and different things of that nature. They were the wise men of the known world at the time, at least in the East. These men were also known so well that countries in the East would inquire of these men to come and basically investigate the people they had on hand to see who would fit the bill to be a king of their country. These magi themselves, they weren't kings, but they were king makers. Now, we have songs like We Three Kings of Orient Are, stuff like that. They weren't kings themselves, but they made kings. And it wasn't just an arbitrary thing. These men had to be well versed in a lot of things. And the Egyptians had their form of magi. It wasn't the magi as we speak of here, but the Egyptians had their own wise men, if you will, to help get the government going. So when Joseph was in Egypt, he was made the guy to run over the place. So he would have been like their version of the chief magi, as Daniel was a chief in the Babylonian Empire over what later would become, or at least what we hear in the Bible, as the magi or wise men. And so, and most countries do have wise men that give counsel to their kings or presidents. But as of late, the Americans have chosen the fools instead. But anyway, wise men have always been around to give advice to the people. And it wasn't just that they were wise men that gave advice, but these men actually set laws. And you'll hear of it referred to as the law of the Medes and the Persians. These people were the ones who wrote the law of the Medes and the Persians. Now we're going to look at Daniel chapter 6, verse 12. And they came near and said before the king concerning the king's instructions, did you not sign an injunction that any man who seeks to make a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days will be cast into the lion's den? And the king answered and said, the word is certain according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. So this law of the Medes and the Persians actually was written by what we call the wise men or the magi. These were powerful men that people around the world listened to. And when they wrote the law, at least in the Eastern world at that time, it was the law of the land. And we had something similar to that throughout Europe through the Middle Ages, right up until the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and even after that, right up until we made our Constitution, we were all under a type of law called the Magna Carta, which was the same type of system, in essence, as the law of the Medes and the Persians. That was a standard. That was the law set out. And even the fact that we had our American Revolution, you can find that the king had breached the Magna Carta, thereby giving us right to have a revolt against England. Most people don't realize that. Though it was, set off for many issues, but the king did breach the law in the Magna Carta with his tyrannical government. And so that's why a lot of if you read our original Constitution, the reason they laid out as an indictment against King George III was because of his, we weren't allowed to have a redress of grievance and a lot of other tyrannical things. Well, that breached the law that everyone was under in the European, community at large. Even though every country had their own laws, it was all subjected to the Magna Carta, just as the law of the Medes and the Persians. See, the Magi were the ones who were instructing the Medes and the Persians when it was time for them to go to war with Rome. Rome was in the west, the Medes and the Persian empires were in the east. And they would have wars, and they had at least 3 major wars, all of which took place in the middle ground, which we know as Israel. So Israel has had wars, even wars that weren't against them. They were just caught up in the mess. So they were respected. Even after the wars were over, even the Romans respected the wise men, the Magi, for their knowledge. Again, they had knowledge of astrological things going on. And the Bible says that the stars were set for signs and seasons. And so they studied that. Well, then they also had the occult part to them. But while they were for about 64 years, they were under the leadership of Daniel. So in that time that they were under the leadership of Daniel, it's got to be assumed at least some of them, if not all of them, started to go toward the Judean God, right? So the Magi, they themselves were believers in one God. They were monotheists. And so a lot of the things that they believed there had to be a sacrifice and atonement for sin. So they believed a lot of things that the Jews already taught. There were some things that they didn't, but by the time Daniel comes in, now he's instructing them in the truth. Obviously, because they make the story later, right? And so when they're coming to see Jesus, how did they even know what to be looking for? Well, they knew what the prophecies of Daniel's 70 weeks were. And they knew they had to be getting close to the end of that 70 weeks just by reading the prophecies and the fulfillment of things that were going on. And it also says that they had followed his star. And so when they saw his star appear, they knew. They were wise enough to put together that this is something of importance. Now, was that star an actual physical star like we see today? I don't know, but it had attributes that didn't seem like that because it was leading them. It was going before them. Where else do we see something leading people at night? Well, you have to go to when Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt. It said they were overshadowed by a cloud that kept them from the burning sun during the day and a pillar of fire by night that led them. That pillar of fire was the Shekinah glory of God. And so God was leading them by a pillar of fire. Well, that is the same context in which these wise men came from the east and they were being led, and it took them to Jerusalem. And east of Jerusalem, and I believe it's, I don't know the direction, maybe northeast, but anyway, it's just beyond and to the east of Jerusalem was Bethlehem. So they had to pass through Jerusalem. Well, when they were coming, it's not like the stories we hear in the Christmas songs, We Three Kings. Well, they weren't kings, and there weren't just three of them. Magi traveled in bands of upward to 1,000, maybe even 2,000 people. And they didn't, apparently, I don't think they were nomadic, but they may have been, but they traveled with their animals and everything. So they may have been just nomadic people and that they traveled, but they didn't travel with just three guys. And we know that it wouldn't make any sense if we kind of read in Matthew 2. So we're going to read Matthew 2, and we're going to go to verse 12. So 2 to 12. And I want you to pay attention to a few things as I read. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him. And Herod the king heard this, and he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. Of them there and gathered together all the chief priests and the scribes and the people. He inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And then said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet, And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a leader who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and carefully determined from them the time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him. And after hearing this, they went on their way, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east was going on before them, until it came and stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after coming to the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell on the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi departed to their own country by another way. Now, you look at the first part here, it says, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the days of Herod the king. Now the Magi did not show up at the manger. Now that's a common misconception, and you see people's nativity scenes, and you got the Magi and three kings there, or whatever. Again, they were king makers. And these men wanted to see the king that God made. Now, these men were used to making kings, instructing them. And the king at that time had to understand and know all the law of the Medes and the Persians. They had to know science, they had to know math. Obviously had to know geography to know where their land was. So these men were used to making kings, but they came to see the king that God had made. Not just any God, but the God of Daniel. And we know that they had to have understood the Pentateuch, at least the first 5 books of Moses. And they probably understood a lot more than that, the whole Torah, the Old Testament, because that's where we'll find Daniel. So they were looking for this God of gods, and they knew that the one that they found was the King of kings. A king that they themselves didn't make, but the one who made them was the one who made the king. And they wanted to see this king that God had made. So they weren't just there to look at him. They were going to find him so that they could worship him. And that is the heart of evangelism. That is the heart of discipleship, is to worship God. That is what they wanted to do. That is what we should want to do. So these men, they arrive about 2 years after, and we'll get to that, but they showed up not at the Nativity. It was about 2 years after the fact, by the time they got there. It says, "For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." So, why would this Herod be so troubled by these men coming to worship another king? Well, obviously, he felt threatened for his kingdom, because the Jews didn't even count him as their king, because this man, Herod, was not even a Jew. And to the Jews, a king of Israel must be a Jew. But how did he become the king? Well, Herod had helped out the Romans. He was a Syrian. And he had helped out the Romans at some point, and I don't remember exactly how it was, but as a reward to him, they gave him this little obscure nowhere land to be king of called Israel. And so they put Herod in charge as the king of this little no man's land, Israel. To the Romans, it was no more than just a battleground. And if this is going to, this is how we can pay this guy back for helping us out. And I don't remember what he did, but anyway, they made this guy the king, but he was from Syria. And so the Jews didn't acknowledge him as the king. So when these wise men, these magi's come and say, "Where is the king that is born, the king of Israel?" Well, this guy, Herod, knows, I don't really have a birthright here. I'm not even a Jew, not even from Israel. So he felt threatened, and he wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to lose his power. So he tells them, it says, "And he gathered all the chief priests and the scribes and the people, and he was inquiring of them where the Christ would be born." So now, he must have learned from the Magi that this king of Israel would be the prophesied Christ, the Messiah, Meshach. And so he wanted to know where he was going to be born. And so they, the ones who knew, the Jews that were under him, that actually knew the Torah and the Pentateuch, and they knew the prophecies, they said, "Well, Bethlehem of Judah. And so then Herod secretly calls. So now he finds out. So, okay, now I know this king is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. But I don't know when he was born. Was he born yesterday? Was he born 2 years ago? I don't know. But he deduced from the Magi's when they set out and they started following the star. That's why I want to know, when did the star appear? All right. So we know that that star set out probably 2 years before. And so now they're here today. So they ended up, going to see Jesus. The Magi went. And Herod's like, well, when you go, tell me where he's at, and I'll come and worship him myself. Well, these are wise men. I don't think they were duped by this guy. Firstly, he probably doesn't look like the rest of the Jews. But this is why I called it the wise men and the fool. The fool was Herod. And they would have seen through that, and they would have seen that he himself was the fool, because we are coming all this distance. We've traveled this long. Come with us. You want to worship him. He's not far from you. But he said, well, when you see him, send word. Come back and tell me where he's at. So they traveled as an army. Right? And they're coming all this way to worship this child when they find him. Herod knows he can't just go out with some of his men and kill him on the spot, because they themselves would have been killed by the Magi. These were not just nerds. These were warriors. These guys had their swords and they had their men. So they were wise not only in mental things, but wise in the art of war. So he knew, I can't do anything right now, but you go find him. When you find him, send word. Come back and tell me. So he goes out. They go out, and they find him with his mother. They saw the child and Mary, his mother, and fell on the ground and worshipped him. So they found him in a house. And the stars stood over the house. So again, stars don't do that. That's not what stars do. So what was the star? Well, the star was most likely the same kind of Shekinah glory, that fire that led the Israelites out of Egypt. And so when the star stood over the house, not the manger, a manger was probably a cave, could have been a wooden structure, whatever it was, it housed the animals, and that's where they were fed. So basically a small barn. That's where he was born. But now he's living in a house. So they didn't travel any farther away, but they were on their way to go take the census. And on their way, she goes into labor. And it fulfilled the prophecy that he would be born in Bethlehem of Judea. But he wasn't the only one that was born there. King David was born there as well. And that is where Jacob buried his wife Rachel. So it was a place of importance to God. And so they still lived in that area near where he was born. And when the wise men got there, it was about 2 years after his birth. It says he saw Mary and the child were in the house. So they go there and they worship him. They fall down and worship this child because they know who he is, even though as a 2-year-old he doesn't even know who he is. He restricted his knowledge. He did not equate his Godhead something to be grasped. He humbled himself and became a man. And so he grew in stature and in wisdom and in favor with God and man. So he's 2 years old. He sees all these people coming. He doesn't know what's going on. A big party as far as he knows. But they give him gifts. Now it records 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now frankincense is like a perfume. It's for happiness, joy, refreshment. And gold is for a king. And myrrh is what they anointed dead bodies with. It was a strong perfume to anoint the dead. So whether the wise men understood that these gifts, that's what they represented, we don't know. But I assume they were wise men. They probably understood. Because no doubt that they read Isaiah chapter 53, and they knew it was talking about him, that he would be wounded for our transgressions, and by his stripes we would be healed, and they would pierce him. And all of Matthew 53, they knew. That's why they brought the myrrh. That prophecy of his life and his death on that cross. And that's why they made the Bible, is because the wisdom that they had to know who Christ was and what his mission was, even before he knew what it was. And so, then we know that the wise men were, at least one of them, maybe all of them, I don't know. They were given a dream or a vision. If an angel shows up and tells them to depart another way and don't go back to Herod. So Herod knows that he's been duped by these guys. They haven't shown back up. So he sends out his men to Bethlehem to kill all the male children 2 years and younger. Well, at that same time, Joseph himself had a dream or a vision. An angel shows up and tells him, take your wife and the child and go into Egypt and don't come out until I tell you. So we know that he went into Egypt for 2 years. And then the angel shows up again and he says, all right, it's time to go back into Israel. Well, that fulfilled the prophecy where God said, out of Egypt will I call my son. And then the other part of the prophecy, as Joseph is going back, he finds out that Herod was dead, but his son had taken over as king, and he was afraid that the son was going to do what the old man tried to do. So the angel tells him, go to Nazareth. And so he set up shop in Nazareth, fulfilling the other part of the prophecy, and he shall be called a Nazarene. So God was working through all of these events to bring about the miracle of the redemption of human beings. And it all started back in Genesis chapter 3 when God tells Satan, you will bruise his heel and he will crush your head. Like I wrote my note, but I went ahead of it, but we have this misconception that there were 3 wise men and they showed up at the birth. And obviously it's not so. It's not the way it was. But there were magi. And the lesson we can learn from the magi, the fact that they were Gentiles and they went to worship the king of the Jews, they knew that he wasn't just the king of the Jews, he was the King of kings, of all people, of all creation. So they went to worship him themselves. So when Herod secretly met with these guys, obviously he was trying to get the knowledge of where he was and when he was born. But he was the fool in the story. Now let's go to John 1. Actually, yeah, it's John chapter 1, verse 9 through 13. And this is where I'm going to kind of leave off till next week. So I want you to have an understanding of some of the people, the players, that maybe we kind of gloss over. But who were these guys? Well, the Magi were there, made the story to show that the Gentiles were always part of God's redemptive plan. God had always planned to save the Gentiles as well as the Jews. But he had to let the process play out. And Jesus gives the parable of the olive tree. And because they rejected him, they were like that olive branch that was cut off. And we were a wild olive branch that were grafted in. But they will be grafted in again. So there'll be a time coming when Jesus will rule from Israel. And all of Israel at that time will be saved. They will be grafted in again. So, God has not given up on his people Israel. And just because we have accepted the Jewish Messiah as our Messiah, we should not be bragging or boasting that, oh, we have salvation and the Jews don't. Because that would not be a real Christian. That'd be a false Christian, and you would be cut off from that tree that you think you're grafted into anyway. Because God can graft back in the original branch, and he will. And that's what the Bible teaches us. So I'm just going to leave you with John 1, 9 through 13. There was the true light which, coming into the world, enlightens everyone. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. And the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them gave he the right to become the children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And with that, we're going to end in prayer. Thank you, Lord, for your word. Thank you for this time of year that we can remember you and the work that you did as you went through this life, being born in a humble manger, lived a humble life without sin, gave us direction, gave us examples, and you paid the price that we may be set free. Help us to go out and teach others, and let us look forward to your second advent, when you come back in vengeance and destroy the ungodly and redeem your bride, the church. Amen.